We're now recording. So, sorry, David. I was just saying that David holds an MA in EdTech and TESOL and the Trinity Dip TESOL. And he's worked with primary and secondary young learners in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And during this time, he's designed courses focused on developing communicative skills and preparation courses for the Cambridge Young Learner exams. He's presented at numerous conferences and online events, and is also a regular contributor to teaching magazines and an avid blogger. So without further ado, over to you, Dave.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Maybe in the chats you could just quickly tell us where you're joining us from for this worldwide conference and what time of day it is where you are. I'm currently in Almaty, Kazakhstan. It's just gone 12:30, early afternoon. Just get a picture of who we have with us here today. So Heike's got up early for this one. Thank you for that. Okay, and we have a participant in Russia as well. Obviously morning time for you as well. Must be the western part of the country. Okay, so we're quite localized with Wendy in Uzbekistan, not so far away. And Jennifer's joining us from Spain as well. Okay, fantastic. Well, first thing then, just to put another question to you. ELT is a profession that's full of acronyms and abbreviations that represent different specialisms. So can you, in the chat box please, name an ELT specialism? Can be as an acronym or you can type it out, it's up to you. Let's just see what you come up with. And welcome, Hein, thank you for introducing yourself there. So yeah, we've got there Phil going English for academic purposes, and we've got English for specific purposes coming in as well, very young learners, primary, and then English as a second language, IELTS and all the exam training courses. Yeah, and ELF as well, English as a lingua franca. Okay. Yes, and CELTA, if we're specializing in the teacher training side of things, that would come up as well. Of course, amongst the ones we haven't mentioned, there would be things like ESOL and Business English and so on. The point I was trying to make is a lot of these specialisms, they seem to relate to general English, and I find they often relate to the worlds of academic English and teaching of general English to adults. It's when we get into thinking about what are the specialisms in young learner ELT that it changes slightly. So can you name some of those for me again in the chat? What are some of the specialisms we have in this field of young learner English language teaching? We've already had a couple mentioned earlier in the chat, such as Jennifer mentioned very young learners, and Wendy mentioned primary ELT. Are there any other specialisms we have when we teach young learners? Okay, not many responses coming through yet, but maybe that's because, yeah, often we don't think about it that way. Often when we think about specialisms with young learners, I think there's a tendency to think about age groups. So we have very young learners and early years. We have primary, maybe we divide that into lower primary and upper primary, and then secondary, and again we often talk about lower secondary and upper secondary. Yeah, Calvita mentions there SEN, which of course is something that can influence ELT, but I guess it's not really a strand of ELT, but something that crosses over from other things. And the only other thing people mention quite often is, as a specialism, exam prep courses, like we might mention FCE or IELTS and so on. So that's something I think needs to be addressed, because I think there are specialisms in Young Learner ELT beyond just dividing it into age groups. And one of those that I'm going to be focusing on today is the area I'm currently working in of EAL. So we'll start with a quick definition of that. Now, obviously, EAL, if we expand it out, stands for English as an Additional Language. But what does it actually mean? How is it different from EFL or ESL? Does anybody have any thoughts on that before I give mine? I am pitching this talk more at people who maybe work in the world of EFL and don't have that much familiarity with EAL. But yes, Phil's got the idea there that it is something to do with English in schools. I'll just see what else is coming up. I will mention CLIL a little bit later on. There are some elements, maybe that. Okay, so we're getting some ideas, like it's an additional tool to explore the world. So yeah, and that idea about multilingualism, and it's not just about one main language that we bring in. I wouldn't say it focuses on primary so much. A lot of the things I'll be talking about today focus on working in secondary. And yeah, the idea of multiple languages as well. This is often used in schools, as Phil said earlier. And the idea is that this is in a context where English, the reason the students are learning English and developing their English skills is because the majority of their educational experience, the majority of the input they're receiving in class every day is delivered in English. So English is a medium of instruction, usually in the school, and then there will be students, this could be in a UK context or in an international context. There will be students who come into the school with a low level of English. Maybe in the international context they're coming in from a local state school or private school where their country's native language has been the main language of instruction, and English has taken the form of EFL lessons. So then they have to transition into developing their language skills to be able to access the curriculum. And it also, in terms of that support, the style in which the support is given is quite different. We have, when I've worked in schools where English was taught as a foreign language, we would have our English language lessons. But here, we do have those kind of English support lessons going on, but we also are looking at in-class support, and we're looking at working with teachers to ensure that students are getting full access to the curriculum. Now, I brought up here, this is something from the Department for Education in the UK. They have some scales for assessing the language development of EAL pupils. One thing that we can't really transfer from the world of EFL so well here is the scales, going from A1 up to C1 and C2. The reason for that is because in this context we can quite often get children who are at a more accelerated rate of language development, and then you reach the point where they're beyond the B1 scale. However, when you get into the descriptors of higher end B1 and B2, those descriptors start to mention particular skills, cognitive and critical thinking skills, that do not transfer to that age group. So quite often we will have students here in lower secondary whose English is still developing, but they are speaking, it gets difficult to assess them beyond a B1 level, because their developing competence, as you can see it says there under section C, they're developing competence, but they're not, what they're producing is not matching up to what's in those B1 descriptors. Now, I did, when I was researching everything and just double-checking everything for this talk, I did find, when I looked this up just to check everything, that apparently the Department for Education in the UK have now done away with this after a very short time. They got rid of it at the start of this academic year, which most people seem to think is a shame. One thing that this does, which perhaps the Common European Framework doesn't, is addresses the idea that I've put on the slide here of conversational fluency against academic proficiency. And what you will often find in an international school context is, we know, especially in primary years, how children absorb and develop their language very quickly, depending on how much input they get. And when they're interacting with their teachers and with their friends, and they're using English in the classroom and outside the classroom, they start to develop their conversational skills very quickly. But what you will often find with these students is they will speak very well. You will be impressed by their confidence and fluency when they speak, but when it comes to producing a piece of written work, an assignment, often that same level of language is not there. So that's where we bring in the idea of academic proficiency, and that's what we start to look at a lot as these students move into the secondary years, is making sure that they develop that academic proficiency. So a lot of our EAL work there will be focusing not solely on developing their skills and their comprehension and their communicative abilities and their grammar, but it will also focus on doing some very specific tasks with that, such as writing essays, writing science reports, tackling maths questions, just looking at maths questions, and you'll see how a lot of practical math problems will contain conditional clauses, which they need to be able to access and decode in order to complete those tasks properly. So yeah, I've started to talk a little bit about this already, but I just want to focus on some of the key differences between the worlds of EAL and EFL. It's not just one letter that's the difference. So one thing I found in my work across both areas is that EFL, we often focus on a communicative outcome, and a lot of teacher training courses will focus on this. Most recently, I took the Trinity Young Learners certificate, and prior to that, I'd completed my Delta also with my DIPTESOL also with Trinity, and the focus there very much was on having a productive outcome at the end of the lesson, and the general advice was that should be something where the students are producing, they're engaged in a speaking activity or they're engaged in some other kind of communicative aspect, and that's where you show your evidence that they have reached the aims that you planned at the start of the lesson. However, in EAL, especially as we get into secondary learners, I find that the focus often then shifts onto an assessed piece of work, and that will often be a written piece of work. We talk about the plenary session a lot when we're planning lessons in the international schools, and it's not like our conference plenary that we're used to, but rather a 10 or 15-minute section at the end of the lesson where students have the chance to reflect and think about what they've learned and go back. And a lot of self-assessment and peer assessment is encouraged in this process. One other key difference to focus on is the rate of acquisition. Now, I did mention this briefly earlier, but I find just because of that increased amount of input that students receive, and the fact that it's not only directed language-focused input, but it's just the general language in use kind of input, their rate of acquisition is very fast. It's a semi-immersive environment, especially in an international school, where most of their school day will pass in English. Might not be the case at home, but most of their school day will pass in English, and they accelerate through those levels very quickly. Now, as a result of that does affect the kind of materials we use. Now, in the primary years, we often find that some of the primary course books that touch on that high A2 and low B1 level can be used. However, we often find, especially in secondary, that there aren't really any available materials, because as I mentioned before, they reach a point where their grammar and vocabulary is going beyond what the Common European Framework describes. However, age-wise, they're not able to reach some of the other more cognitive ideas that are in the framework about critical thinking skills and analysis and so on. So you will find a lot of authentic material gets used in an EAL context. And this will be, for example, I was doing some lessons last week themed around Halloween with Year 7 students, where I was presenting them with different infographics and posters and getting them to do some research. But what makes this different from the first language English lesson is then, of course, they are going to come across language that they're unfamiliar with. So there's a lot of learner training that comes into this, with getting students to develop their vocabulary and expand their lexis. That's another thing that happens with the rate of acquisition, and something that there is a similarity here between EFL and EAL, where in EFL, especially in secondary, we often talk about that B1, B2 plateau. There's that point where they see their progress slows down greatly, and it becomes much more. It takes a longer time for the students to keep progressing to the next level. There is a similar thing with EAL students as well, that they develop and they pick up this extensive range of English quickly, but then if you're not careful, they can kind of plateau and not develop it further. So we do need to bring in a lot of activities with working on vocabulary and lexis, and encouraging them to go out to these authentic materials and identify those words that they're unfamiliar with. I encourage them to keep what I call a lexical log, where they're recording language, not just from the lessons they have with me, but also from their science lessons, from their geography lessons, from their homework tasks, so they can keep a track of their language development. And then also lesson outcomes, which I did get a little bit ahead of myself on earlier, that often the outcome of the lesson is more academic. It's almost like here in EAL we're doing something like EAP, like English for Academic Purposes, but we're bringing it forward to a much younger age. And then as we move up to the older students, of course, as they reach the age of 15, as they get into the sixth form kind of age, they need to be prepared to sit examinations which are designed for first language students. So then again we need a much stronger academic focus. So there's a dual focus going on in the lesson, where we're often having to develop language whilst also getting students to raise their awareness of and their use of these various conventions for structuring an essay or writing a short story, which they might be asked to do for their English tests, or coming up with a report, writing a news article. These are all areas that they need to focus on. There are, of course, other similarities in the worlds of EFL and EAL. One thing I've found is both areas encourage very much a student-centered approach. A lot of the things I've just described about getting students to self-discover that vocabulary, to get involved in self and peer assessment, that's something I've experienced both working in a language school context and an international school context, and also encouraging multimodal learning. So there's a variety of activities, there's a variety of sources of language for students to engage with. That's something I've seen heavily encouraged in both areas. Having worked in EFL for a long time, I do feel there's some things that EFL could learn from the way things are done in EAL, which I will just cover now for the next part of this talk. So one thing I would say is stronger links. In EAL, there has to be a strong link between what you're doing in the lesson and what's going on in the rest of their curriculum. And I don't merely mean bringing in some CLIL here, although there are some similarities with CLIL. But we need related topics when we're looking at things in class, but also, as I said earlier, we need related skills. We need to be looking at not only the kind of information that they're going to find useful in their geography lesson, but also the style of writing and engaging with those texts that they're going to have to do in that kind of lesson as well. And coming back to the idea of materials, now I know at higher levels we will often use a lot of authentic materials with our EFL students, but it's something I'm seeing that they do a lot. They do a lot in EAL, and it's something that we could perhaps be doing more in EFL. One of the lovely things in the school I currently work in, and a previous international school I was in, was the library. We have a well-stocked library full of books, not just pitched at language learners, but first language books as well. And we will always encourage our students to access some of those first language books as soon as we can. So the primary learners will be directing them towards some of the shorter Roald Dahl books, for example, and the secondary learners will be getting them to choose some accessible books, even at an A, when we think they're around an A2 level or a beginning level under the guidelines I showed you earlier. We'll encourage them to access those texts as soon as possible. And then also the output we try to make sure is as authentic as possible. So it reflects what they need for their other lessons. It reflects the kind of presentation skills and oral skills that they're going to need, as well as the written skills. And the other thing I would mention is it's always good to demand more. I think in some of my previous EFL contexts and with the training I had, there was often an emphasis on differentiation and ensuring that the lower ability students in the group are able to produce something. Whereas I find in the EAL context, there is also differentiation, but there's very much more an emphasis on pushing those lower ability learners through and getting them to produce higher level work. There's also, when we focus on the higher level, the gifted and talented students, we will raise our expectations there. So even if they've met the highest level of differentiation, we'll still look at ways we can push them forward. And I think, children, and I say this a lot in different talks I've done and articles I've written, I think children are usually capable of a lot more than we give them credit for. They can produce things above their level. They can access texts above their level. They can attempt to use language above their level, just as long as we've got the guidance and the structure in place to push them through. So that was just a brief overview of some of the differences I've experienced between my work in an EFL and an EAL context. So now we have a few minutes left, so I'm happy to respond to any questions you have about any of the differences or your own experiences. Please share those as well. Okay, I see someone's typing in now, so I'll wait for your question to come through. I see Hinde mentions motivation. Of course, there is that level of motivation here, especially when we do have cases where students are taken out of particular lessons. If we feel they need that extra English support, we'll take them out of certain lessons, perhaps the lessons where the English demands are higher, such as humanities. But then there's always that motivation for them that as they start to progress and develop, we will say to them that you're reaching a point now. If you can keep producing at this level, we're going to look at returning you to or adding you into those other lessons and reducing the hours of English support you receive. And that's often a good motivation for them. And yes, it is very immersive. That's one of the main benefits of the situation they're in, that the living language of the school is English. We'll often also withdraw students from other language lessons, such as French or Russian or so on, so that they can focus on English. But again, they want to be learning those other languages along with their peers, so again, that provides them with a good motivation to raise their level of English at the same time.
Finish that session. Thanks so much. It was very, very interesting.